Welcome to tonight's Miss Marple Mystery. Before the truth erupts, I need to know, where are you listening from tonight? And tell me, which Christie twist still shocks you the most? Share it below. Because in this village, every smile hides a secret, every whisper hides a lie, and nothing, absolutely nothing, is what it looks like. Let's begin. The village of Little Wychford prided itself on maintaining the sort of peaceful English charm that appeared on postcards and in the dreams of city dwellers. On this particular Saturday afternoon in late June, the annual church garden fete was proceeding with its customary blend of gentle competition, mild gossip, and the sort of social maneuvering that could make a military campaign seem straightforward by comparison. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly on a folding chair beneath the spreading branches of an ancient chestnut tree, her knitting needles clicking in their familiar rhythm as she observed the cheerful chaos around her. She had arrived in Little Wychford only that morning, accepting an invitation from her old friend Mrs. Hester Torrington, the vicar's wife, who had insisted that a change of scenery would do Miss Marple a world of good. The mysterious telegram, tucked safely in her handbag, suggested that perhaps someone else had known of her travel plans, though how, she could not begin to imagine. The vicarage lawn presented a picture of quintessential English village life. Bunting fluttered in the warm breeze. Children darted between stalls with sticky fingers and bright smiles, and the ladies of the parish had arranged themselves strategically near the tea urns, where the most interesting conversations invariably took place. Mrs. Torrington bustled about with the determined efficiency of a woman who had organized 47 such events, and intended to see this one succeed despite the weather, the wasps, and Mrs. Penbury's tendency to announce other people's personal business at volume. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, sharp as winter frost despite her 70-odd years, moved thoughtfully over the assembled villagers. There was Miss Letitia Crampton, tall and angular, examining the jam stall with the critical eye of someone who had strong opinions about proper fruit-to-sugar ratios. Young Geoffrey Torrington had returned from London for the weekend and was attempting to charm the local girls while simultaneously avoiding his mother's pointed suggestions about helping with the coconut shy. The vicar himself, Reverend Mr. Torrington, was engaged in earnest conversation with Colonel Weatherby about the cricket pavilion roof, their voices carrying the comfortable weight of men who had discussed the same topics for the better part of 2 decades. It was then that Miss Marple noticed her. The woman stood at the edge of the gathering, just beyond the boundary marked by the vicarage gate, observing the festivities with an intensity that seemed oddly out of place. She appeared to be in her early 40s, elegantly dressed in a pale green summer frock that spoke of expensive taste and careful attention to detail. Her dark hair was swept back in a sophisticated chignon, and she wore gloves, an unusual choice for such a casual village event. There was something in her posture, a controlled stillness, that reminded Miss Marple of a cat watching a mouse hole with infinite patience. What struck Miss Marple as particularly curious was the woman's gaze. Rather than taking in the general scene with the mild interest of a casual observer, her eyes moved systematically from person to person, as if she were searching for someone specific. When those eyes finally settled on Miss Marple herself, the effect was startling. The woman's carefully composed expression shifted for just a moment. A flicker of recognition, perhaps even satisfaction, crossed her features. Then she smiled. A brilliant, practiced expression that somehow failed to reach her eyes, and began walking purposefully across the lawn toward Miss Marple's quiet corner. Mrs. Torrington, ever alert to the presence of unfamiliar faces at her carefully orchestrated event, intercepted the stranger with the brisk efficiency of a border collie managing sheep. "I don't believe we've met," Mrs. Torrington said, extending her hand with genuine warmth. "I'm Hester Torrington. Are you visiting someone in the village?" "How kind of you," the woman replied, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone well-educated but without any particular regional accent. "I'm Mrs. Evelyn Sinclair. I've recently taken a cottage just outside the village, the old mill house on Bracken Lane. I thought I should introduce myself to the community." Miss Marple continued her knitting, but her attention was entirely focused on the conversation taking place just a few feet away. Something about Mrs. Sinclair's manner suggested careful preparation, the way she had her story ready, the practiced ease with which she deflected Mrs. Torrington's naturally curious questions about her background and circumstances. "How lovely," Mrs. Torrington was saying. We're always delighted to welcome new residents. You must let me introduce you to some of our local characters. Oh, and you simply must meet my dear friend Miss Marple. She's visiting from Street. Mary Mead, and she has the most fascinating insights into people and their little ways. Mrs. Sinclair's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Her smile became fixed, her shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, and her gloved hands tightened on her small handbag. When she turned to face Miss Marple, there was something in her expression that made the elderly spinster's instincts prickle with warning. Miss Jane Marple. Mrs. Sinclair said, and it was not a question. How very interesting to meet you. At last. The phrase "at last" hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded the woman with polite curiosity, though every nerve in her body had suddenly become alert. "I'm afraid you have the advantage of me, Mrs. Sinclair," Miss Marple said gently. "I don't believe we've been introduced before today." "No, we haven't," Mrs. Sinclair agreed, her smile never wavering. "But one hears things, doesn't one? About people with unusual talents for understanding human nature. Your reputation extends beyond the boundaries of Street Mary Mead, Miss Marple. Some of us find such reputations quite fascinating." There was something in the way she emphasized "some of us" that sent a chill down Miss Marple's spine. The woman spoke as if she were part of some group, some collective that had been discussing Miss Marple and her involvement in various unpleasant affairs. But who could such a group be? And why would they have any interest in a quiet spinster from a small village? Mrs. Torrington, sensing an undercurrent she couldn't quite identify, attempted to lighten the conversation. "Oh, Miss Marple is far too modest about her insights. She has the most extraordinary ability to see through people's pretenses. Just last month, she helped resolve that dreadful business with the missing church funds. Turned out to be— I'm sure Miss Marple prefers not to discuss such matters at social gatherings," Mrs. Sinclair interrupted smoothly. Her eyes never left Miss Marple's face. "After all, some secrets are better left undisturbed, don't you think? Some investigations can be quite dangerous for everyone involved." The word "dangerous" seemed to echo in the warm afternoon air. Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken, though she maintained her expression of mild interest. This woman was not making idle conversation, she was delivering a message, perhaps even a warning. "I find," Miss Marple said carefully, "that truth has a way of emerging, regardless of our preferences. People often reveal far more about themselves than they intend, simply through their choice of words and actions." Mrs. Sinclair's smile became sharper, more predatory. "How very perceptive. Yes. I imagine you've learned a great deal about people over the years, about their secrets, their mistakes, their desperate attempts to hide what they've done." She paused, her gaze intensifying. "But what happens, I wonder, when someone learns your secrets, Miss Marple? When the observer becomes the observed?" Before Miss Marple could respond to this extraordinary statement, a commotion erupted near the raffle table. Geoffrey Torrington was calling out the winning numbers, his voice carrying across the lawn with cheerful authority. "Number 47 wins the bottle of elderflower wine. Number 12 takes home Mrs. Penbury's famous seed cake. And our grand prize, a week's holiday at Seaview Cottage in Street Mary Mead, generously donated by Miss Marple herself, goes to number 63. Mrs. Sinclair reached into her handbag and withdrew a small pink ticket. Her smile, when she looked at it, was triumphant. "Number 63, she said quietly, holding up the ticket for Miss Marple to see. "How remarkably convenient. It seems fate has arranged for me to visit your charming village very soon, Miss Marple. I do hope you'll be there to welcome me properly." As she walked away to claim her prize, Miss Marple felt a profound sense of unease settle over her like a cold fog. The woman's knowledge of her reputation, her veiled threats, and now this convenient coincidence of winning the raffle, none of it felt accidental. Someone had orchestrated this encounter, planned it down to the smallest detail. But as Mrs. Sinclair accepted her prize voucher from young Geoffrey with gracious thanks, Miss Marple noticed one final, chilling detail. The woman glanced back at her with an expression of such cold calculation that it seemed to strip away all pretense of social nicety. In that moment, Miss Marple realized with absolute certainty that Mrs. Evelyn Sinclair, if that was indeed her real name, had not come to Little Wychford by chance. She had come specifically to find Miss Marple, and the mysterious telegram that morning had been merely the opening move in a game whose rules Miss Marple did not yet understand. What secrets from her past had finally caught up with the gentle spinster detective? And how had a complete stranger managed to orchestrate their meeting with such precision? More disturbing still, what did Mrs. Sinclair plan to do during her convenient week-long stay in Street Mary Mead? For the remainder of the afternoon, Miss Marple maintained her composure beneath the chestnut tree, though her knitting needles moved with less certainty than usual. The mysterious Mrs. Sinclair had melted back into the crowd after claiming her prize, moving among the villagers with practiced ease. Yet Miss Marple noticed how she seemed to be gathering information rather than simply making pleasant conversation. Each introduction, each casual exchange appeared calculated, as if the woman were mapping the social landscape of Little Wychford with military precision. Mrs. Torrington returned, carrying 2 cups of tea, her usually cheerful demeanor clouded by obvious perplexity. She settled beside Miss Marple with a troubled sigh, her eyes following Mrs. Sinclair's progress through the gathering. "What an unusual woman," Mrs. Torrington murmured, though her tone suggested she found Mrs. Sinclair more disturbing than interesting. "I can't quite place her manner educated, certainly, but there's something almost theatrical about how she speaks. And Jane, did you notice how she seemed to know exactly who you were before I made any introductions?" Miss Marple accepted her teacup gratefully, using the familiar ritual to mask her growing unease. "Yes, I did notice that particular detail. She mentioned hearing about my reputation, though I cannot imagine how my small involvement in local matters would have reached someone supposedly new to the Pensacudio area." "That's precisely what troubles me," Mrs. Torrington said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "After you spoke with her, I made some inquiries. Mrs. Penbury was quite adamant that the Millhouse cottage on Bracken Lane has been empty for months. The London owners haven't rented it to anyone. She's absolutely certain of it. So where exactly is Mrs. Sinclair staying? And why would she lie about something so easily verified?" This revelation sent another chill through Miss Marple's already troubled thoughts. If Mrs. Sinclair was not residing where she claimed, then her entire presence in Little Wychford was built upon deception. More disturbing still was the woman's apparent knowledge of Miss Marple's identity and reputation, knowledge that suggested careful research rather than casual village gossip. As the garden fete wound toward its conclusion and the last stalls were dismantled, Miss Marple found herself drawn into the comfortable domesticity of the vicarage kitchen. While helping Mrs. Torrington stack teacups, she carefully steered the conversation toward their mysterious visitor. "Mrs. Sinclair certainly made quite an impression today," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Such confidence in a newcomer to village life." "Indeed," Mrs. Torrington replied, pausing with a saucer in her hands, "though I must say, there was something almost predatory about the way she watched people. And that business with the raffle, such remarkable luck. Winning the one prize that would take her directly to your village, Jane." The word predatory hung in the air like smoke. Miss Marple had observed the same quality but hadn't quite articulated it so precisely. Mrs. Sinclair had indeed moved through the crowd like a hunter, selecting her targets with care. Over the following days, as Miss Marple settled into the gentle rhythm of village life, Mrs. Sinclair became the primary topic of local conversation. At the village shop, Mrs. Piggott recounted how the mysterious woman had purchased only the most expensive items, paying with crisp banknotes and displaying an odd familiarity with luxury goods that seemed incongruous with her claimed simple country retirement. Colonel Weatherby, encountering Miss Marple during an evening stroll, grumbled about strange activities at the supposedly empty mill house. "Lights burning at all hours," he complained. "And yesterday I saw a motor car there, expensive-looking thing, driven far too fast for our narrow lanes. If she's really taken the cottage, why all the secrecy?" Young Geoffrey Torrington provided perhaps the most revealing information, though inadvertently, speaking with obvious admiration about Mrs. Sinclair's sophistication. He mentioned her extensive knowledge of London society and her casual references to people and places that suggested connections far beyond those of an ordinary widow seeking rural tranquility. Most disturbing of all was Mrs. Penbury's latest intelligence, delivered in her characteristically penetrating whisper that carried across the entire post office. "She's had visitors, mark my words. A gentleman caller, very well dressed, arrived in that fast motor car, stayed for hours they did. And when he left, she watched from her window until he was completely out of sight. Not the behavior of someone settling into quiet country life, if you ask me." Miss Marple absorbed each piece of information like a sponge, her mind automatically cataloging inconsistencies and contradictions. The elegant stranger who knew her name, the false residents, the mysterious visitors, the convenient raffle victory. None of it felt coincidental. Someone had orchestrated this elaborate charade, and the telegram that morning suggested they possessed knowledge they intended to use against her. As she prepared for bed that evening, Miss Marple retrieved the crumpled telegram from her handbag and smoothed it against the coverlet. "I know what you did." The phrase seemed to pulse with malevolent intent in the lamplight. Whatever game Mrs. Sinclair was playing, it was clear that Miss Marple herself was not merely a participant but the primary target, and the woman's planned visit to Street Mary Mead would mark the beginning of a confrontation that had been months, perhaps years, in the making. But what secret from Miss Marple's past had finally surfaced to threaten her peaceful existence? And how had Mrs. Sinclair managed to orchestrate such an elaborate deception while remaining completely unknown to the very people she claimed to have joined? Sleep proved elusive for Miss Marple that night. The comfortable guest room at the vicarage, with its rose-patterned wallpaper and gentle night sounds of the countryside, should have provided perfect rest. Instead, her mind circled restlessly around the day's encounters, particularly the calculated precision with which Mrs. Sinclair had maneuvered their meeting. The mysterious telegram lay folded in her handbag on the bedside table, its 5 words seeming to pulse with malevolent intent in the darkness. By morning, Miss Marple had reached a decision that would have surprised those who knew her only as a gentle village spinster. If Mrs. Sinclair intended to play a game of cat and mouse, then it behooved Miss Marple to understand exactly what sort of creature she was dealing with. After breakfast, while Mrs. Torrington busied herself with parish correspondence, Miss Marple announced her intention to take a morning constitutional. "Such lovely countryside," she murmured, adjusting her sensible hat. "I thought I might explore some of those charming lanes we passed yesterday." The walk to Bracken Lane took her through the heart of Little Wychford's social network. At the village shop, Mrs. Piggott proved a fountain of information, her natural curiosity having been thoroughly piqued by their elegant visitor. "Paid with a £50 note, she did," Mrs. Piggott confided, leaning across the counter with obvious relish. "For a bottle of aspirin and some writing paper. Who carries such money for simple purchases?" And the way she examined everything, reading labels like she was memorizing them, very particular about the writing paper too, had to be the expensive cream-colored sort. Nothing common would do. Miss Marple absorbed this intelligence thoughtfully. Expensive tastes, careful attention to detail, and a need for quality writing materials suggested someone accustomed to conducting important correspondence. The £50 note was particularly interesting. It spoke of resources far beyond those of an ordinary widow seeking rural retirement. Her next stop was the cottage of Mrs. Briggs, whose geranium-bordered garden provided an excellent vantage point for observing the comings and goings on Bracken Lane. Mrs. Briggs, delighted to have a sympathetic audience for her observations, proved remarkably well-informed about their mysterious newcomer. 3 visitors she's had since Saturday, Mrs. Briggs reported with evident satisfaction. "All gentlemen, all arriving in motor cars too fine for our lanes. The first came Sunday evening, stayed near 2 hours. The second was yesterday morning, younger man, very nervous-like, kept looking over his shoulder. But the third one, Miss Marple, he was different altogether." "In what way?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Mrs. Briggs lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Military bearing, if you know what I mean. Walked like my late husband's colonel used to, all straight back and purpose. And when he left, she watched from the window until his car was completely out of sight, like she was making sure he was really gone. This detail sent a chill through Miss Marple's thoughts. Military connections suggested organization, planning, perhaps even surveillance capabilities far beyond what a single woman could manage alone. The pattern of visitors, nervous younger man, military figure. Extended consultations painted a picture of something far more complex than personal vendetta. As she approached the mill house itself, Miss Marple's trained eye noted several telling details. The cottage windows, supposedly those of a woman settling into quiet country life, were fitted with unusually heavy curtains that blocked all interior view. The garden path showed signs of recent foot traffic despite Mrs. Sinclair's claims of having just arrived. Most significantly, tire tracks in the soft earth beside the cottage indicated multiple vehicles, their patterns suggesting both regular visits and hasty departures. Miss Marple was examining these tracks with particular interest when a voice behind her made her blood run cold. "Gathering evidence, Miss Marple?" She turned slowly to find Mrs. Sinclair standing at the cottage gate, no longer bothering to maintain her facade of pleasant social interaction. The woman's elegant dress and carefully arranged hair remained perfect, but her eyes held a hardness that transformed her entire appearance. "I was merely admiring the countryside," Miss Marple replied mildly, though her heart was beating rather faster than usual. "Of course you were, Mrs." Sinclair's smile was sharp as winter frost. "Just as you were merely making casual conversation with Mrs. Briggs and Mrs. Piggott, your reputation for curiosity precedes you, I'm afraid, though perhaps you should consider that some mysteries are better left unsolved." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with a politeness that made it somehow more chilling than any shouted warning could have been. Miss Marple found herself studying the woman's face with new understanding. This was not the expression of someone driven by personal grievance or emotional turmoil. This was the calculated coldness of someone following orders, someone who viewed Miss Marple not as a person but as an obstacle to be removed. "I've always found," Miss Marple said carefully, "that truth has a way of emerging regardless of our preferences. Secrets, like seeds, have a tendency to grow in the most unexpected places." Mrs. Sinclair's laugh was genuinely amused, though utterly without warmth. "How very philosophical. We shall see, Miss Marple, whether your faith in truth serves you well when you're on your own familiar ground. I do so look forward to our extended acquaintance in Street. Mary Mead." As Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the vicarage, she realized with crystalline clarity that whatever game was being played, the stakes were far higher than she had initially understood. Mrs. Sinclair was not working alone, and her interest in Miss Marple was not personal, it was professional. But what organization possessed both the resources and the motivation to orchestrate such an elaborate surveillance operation against a quiet village spinster, and what secret from her past had finally attracted such dangerous attention? The walk back to the vicarage provided Miss Marple with precious time to process Mrs. Sinclair's unveiled threat, though the woman's transformation from elegant newcomer to cold professional continued to disturb her thoughts. The calculated precision of that encounter, the way Mrs. Sinclair had dropped all pretense of social pleasantries, suggested someone operating under orders rather than personal grievance. More troubling still was the implication that Miss Marple's every movement had been anticipated, perhaps even orchestrated. Mrs. Torrington greeted her return with obvious relief, though her usually serene demeanor showed signs of strain. "Jane, thank goodness you're back. The most dreadful thing has happened. Young Timothy Green hasn't returned from his morning rounds, and his bicycle was found abandoned near the mill stream." Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Timothy Green was the village's cheerful odd-job man, known for his reliability and his unfortunate tendency to be in the wrong place at precisely the right time to overhear interesting conversations. If someone wanted to gather information about village life and its inhabitants, Timothy would be an invaluable, if unwitting, source. The search party that formed within the hour included most of the able-bodied men in Little Wychford. Miss Marple watched from the vicarage window as they spread out across the countryside, their voices carrying a tension that spoke of genuine fear rather than mere concern. When Colonel Weatherby returned with his grim news, the words seemed to hang in the afternoon air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Timothy Green was dead, his body found in the shallow waters near the old mill, not 50 yards from the mill house where Mrs. Sinclair claimed to reside. His pockets had been turned inside out, and a cruel bruise marked his temple. The proximity to Mrs. Sinclair's supposed residence could not, Miss Marple reflected, be mere coincidence. Detective Inspector Craddock's arrival brought the familiar comfort of official competence, though Miss Marple noted how quickly he focused on the most obvious suspect. Silas Crofton, the village's cantankerous groundskeeper, had indeed quarreled publicly with Timothy over missing vegetables and shoddy work. The motive seemed clear, the opportunity evident, and Crofton's belligerent responses to questioning only strengthened the case against him. A straightforward matter, Inspector Craddock declared that evening in the vicarage drawing room. Village quarrels have a way of escalating beyond reason. We'll have Crofton in custody by morning. Miss Marple continued her knitting, offering no immediate comment, though her mind was far from settled. She had observed Silas Crofton for years, irascible certainly, prone to shouting at cats and cursing his tools, but his anger had always been more bluster than genuine threat. Moreover, she could not forget Mrs. Briggs's description of Mrs. Sinclair's recent visitors, particularly the nervous younger man who had called at the mill house just days earlier. Timothy Green, with his cheerful curiosity and habit of appearing where interesting conversations were taking place, would have been perfectly positioned to observe Mrs. Sinclair's mysterious activities. His regular rounds took him past the mill house daily, and his naturally friendly disposition would have made him an ideal source of information about village life and its inhabitants. If Mrs. Sinclair's operation required detailed knowledge of local personalities and relationships, Timothy would have been invaluable until he became a liability. The timing troubled Miss Marple most of all. Timothy's death had occurred within hours of her confrontation with Mrs. Sinclair, when the woman's careful facade had finally slipped to reveal the calculating professional beneath. Had Timothy witnessed something that threatened the elaborate deception? Had his natural curiosity led him to ask the wrong questions of the wrong person? As Inspector Craddock continued, outlining his case against Crofton, Miss Marple found herself studying the patterns emerging from recent events. Mrs. Sinclair's arrival, the false residence, the mysterious visitors, the convenient raffle victory, and now Timothy's death, each element seemed designed to serve a larger purpose, with the young man's murder possibly intended to create the very distraction that would allow Mrs. Sinclair to complete her preparations and depart for Street Mary Mead unobserved. The realization that Timothy Green might have died simply because he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, with his natural curiosity making him a threat to carefully laid plans, filled Miss Marple with a cold anger that she carefully kept hidden beneath her gentle exterior. But what had Timothy discovered about Mrs. Sinclair's true purpose that had cost him his life? And how many other innocent people would be endangered before Miss Marple could unravel the deadly game being played around her? That evening, as the last light faded from the vicarage windows and the village settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple found herself unable to concentrate on her knitting. The comfortable sitting room, with its familiar sounds of Mr. Torrington preparing his Sunday sermon and Mrs. Torrington organizing parish correspondence, should have provided the perfect atmosphere for peaceful reflection. Instead, her mind circled restlessly around the day's events, particularly the calculated precision with which everything seemed to be falling into place, perhaps too neatly into place. She set aside her needlework, a gesture that immediately drew Mrs. Torrington's concerned attention. When Jane Marple abandoned her knitting, serious contemplation invariably followed. "You're troubled about poor Timothy, aren't you?" Mrs. Torrington observed, settling into the chair beside her friend. "Though I must say, I find some comfort in knowing it was Silas Crofton. Dreadful as it sounds, there's something reassuring about familiar wickedness rather than, well, the unknown sort." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "I've been thinking about Timothy's habits, Hester. He was such a methodical young man, always punctual with his rounds. If someone wanted to ensure he would be in a particular location at a particular time, they would only need to observe his routine for a few days." The implications of this observation settled over the room like a cold draft. Before Mrs. Torrington could respond, young Geoffrey appeared in the doorway, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious distress. "Mother, Miss Marple, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but there's something about Timothy's death that's been troubling me." Geoffrey settled into his father's customary chair, his hands clasped tightly together. When we found his bicycle, it was positioned strangely, not fallen over as you'd expect if he'd abandoned it in haste, but carefully placed against the stone wall, almost as if he'd intended to return to it. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. Timothy Green had been known throughout the village for his careful treatment of equipment, but if he had been fleeing from danger, such consideration would hardly have been his priority. There's something else, Geoffrey continued, lowering his voice. I didn't mention it to Inspector Craddock because it seemed too insignificant, but when I was searching near the mill stream, I found this. He produced a small object from his waistcoat pocket, a button of exceptional quality, made of genuine mother-of-pearl with an intricate pattern etched into its lustrous surface. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the sort of detail that spoke of London tailors and prices far beyond the means of anyone in Little Wychford. Miss Marple accepted the button with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from age or recognition, she could not have said. The pearl surface caught the lamplight like a miniature moon, and she found herself recalling Mrs. Sinclair's elegant coat, adorned with buttons of remarkably similar appearance. Geoffrey, you must promise me something, Miss Marple said with unusual gravity. Say nothing of this button to Inspector Craddock or anyone else until I've had time to consider its implications fully, and under no circumstances should you approach Mrs. Sinclair or make inquiries about her activities. The young man nodded solemnly, clearly sensing the importance his discovery had assumed in Miss Marple's estimation. After he departed for his rooms, Miss Marple sat staring at the small button in her palm, her mind working with the methodical precision of a clockmaker examining a delicate mechanism. By morning, Inspector Craddock had acted with characteristic efficiency. Silas Crofton was taken into custody before the village had properly awakened, his protests and curses echoing through the quiet lanes. The evidence seemed compelling. A heavy wrench found in his shed, perfectly capable of inflicting Timothy's fatal injury, combined with his well-documented temper and the recent public quarrel over garden boundaries. A straightforward case, Inspector Craddock announced when he called at the vicarage to report the arrest. Village disputes have a way of escalating beyond reason. We should have this matter resolved within days. Miss Marple continued her knitting, offering no immediate comment, though her mind was far from settled. She had observed human nature for too many years to accept such convenient solutions without question. Silas Crofton was indeed a man of explosive temper, but his rages were typically directed at inanimate objects, his tools, the weather, the general unfairness of existence. She had never known him to raise a hand against another person, despite his theatrical threats. "Inspector," she said gently, "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity. Did anyone actually see Silas near the mill stream yesterday morning?" Craddock frowned slightly. "No direct witnesses, Miss Marple, but the absence of witnesses hardly helps his case, given the evidence we've found." "No, indeed, it doesn't help his case," Miss Marple agreed. "But it is rather convenient for someone else's case, don't you think? If one wanted to commit a crime and have another person blamed for it, choosing someone with Silas's reputation and temperament would be quite clever." The inspector's expression grew more attentive. "You're suggesting someone deliberately framed Crofton?" Miss Marple smiled apologetically. "I'm merely observing that coincidences, while possible, become rather suspicious when they occur at precisely the right moment for precisely the right person. Mrs. Sinclair's arrival, Timothy's death, and Silas's convenient availability as a suspect, it forms quite a neat pattern, doesn't it?" As Inspector Craddock departed with obvious reluctance to reconsider his tidy solution, Miss Marple found herself studying the mother-of-pearl button once again. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Mrs. Sinclair had been present at the scene of Timothy's death, close enough to lose a button from her expensive clothing. The careful positioning of Timothy's bicycle suggested a planned encounter rather than a chance meeting. Most disturbing of all was the growing certainty that Timothy Green had died not for anything he had done, but for something he had witnessed during his daily rounds past the mill house, something that threatened Mrs. Sinclair's carefully constructed deception. But what deadly secret had Timothy stumbled upon that had cost him his life? And how could Miss Marple expose Mrs. Sinclair's involvement before the mysterious woman completed her elaborate plan and vanished forever into the shadows of her well-organized conspiracy? The morning after Inspector Craddock's departure brought Miss Marple little comfort, despite the official certainty surrounding Silas Crofton's arrest. She sat in the vicarage drawing room, the mother-of-pearl button resting in her palm like a small, accusatory eye. The delicate craftsmanship spoke of expense and careful selection, hardly the sort of detail one would expect to find at the scene of a village quarrel gone wrong. Mrs. Torrington, observing her friend's preoccupation, suggested a visit to Miss Amelia Finch, the village seamstress, under the pretense of requiring alterations to Miss Marple's traveling dress. Miss Finch, a woman whose livelihood depended upon noticing the finest details of fabric and construction, proved an invaluable source of information. Such beautiful work, Miss Finch murmured, examining the button through her spectacles. The carving is exquisite, definitely continental, I should say. Not the sort of thing you'd find in an ordinary shop. I've seen similar buttons only once before, on a coat belonging to Mrs. Cavendish Brown when she returned from Paris. Very expensive, custom-made work. She paused, her experienced fingers turning the button in the light. Rather like the buttons I noticed on that elegant Mrs. Sinclair's coat at the garden fete. Quite distinctive. They were. This confirmation, while circumstantial, provided Miss Marple with the connection she had suspected. The button almost certainly belonged to Mrs. Sinclair, placing her at the scene of Timothy's death, despite her careful construction of alibis and alternative explanations. Returning to the vicarage, Miss Marple found Mrs. Torrington sorting through a collection of parish records, her expression troubled. "Jane, I've been thinking about what you said regarding the mill house. I remembered we had some old correspondence about the property. So I retrieved these from the church archives. Among the yellowed papers was a letter from 5 years previous, written by the London property management firm. The language was carefully neutral, but certain phrases stood out with uncomfortable clarity. Persistent, unauthorized inquiries, necessity for discretion, and most significantly, ensuring no further official attention to the premises. Official attention, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. That suggests the property has been of interest to authorities before police. Or perhaps something more serious. Before Mrs. Torrington could respond, young Geoffrey appeared in the doorway, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious distress. "Mother." "Miss Marple, I hope you'll forgive the interruption, but there's something I must tell you. I'm afraid I may have been rather foolish." He settled into a chair, his hands clasped tightly together. "Yesterday evening, I encountered Mrs. Sinclair during my walk. She was most charming, expressing gratitude for my help in searching for poor Timothy. But as we talked, I realized she was asking very specific questions about Miss Marple, about your involvement in various local matters, your methods, which cases had attracted official attention." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. What particular cases interested her most? Geoffrey's face flushed with embarrassment. She seemed especially curious about that business in Street Mary Mead several years ago, the foreign gentleman with the diplomatic connections. She knew far more about it than she should have. Miss Marple, more than I did. Certainly. She spoke as if she were confirming details rather than learning them. A chill ran through Miss Marple's thoughts. That particular case had involved sensitive matters of national security, quietly resolved through unofficial channels, with the understanding that certain details would remain permanently classified. If Mrs. Sinclair possessed knowledge of those events, it suggested access to information far beyond what any ordinary citizen could obtain. The implications crystallized with uncomfortable clarity. Someone with official connections or someone who had once possessed such connections had been monitoring Miss Marple's activities, compiling detailed records of her involvement in sensitive cases. The mysterious telegram, Mrs. Sinclair's elaborate deception, and Timothy's death were all components of a carefully orchestrated plan that had been months, perhaps years, in development. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Sinclair herself appeared at the vicarage door, carrying a basket of expensive hothouse flowers and wearing an expression of perfectly calibrated sympathy. Miss Marple, observing from the drawing room, noted immediately that the elegant pale green coat was nowhere in evidence, replaced by a simple but well-tailored dress. "Such a terrible tragedy," Mrs. Sinclair said as she entered the sitting room. "I feel I must do something to help the community heal. Poor Timothy was such a helpful young man. I encountered him just yesterday morning during my walk. He was kind enough to carry my parcels from the village shop. This casual revelation placed Mrs. Sinclair with Timothy just hours before his death, providing both opportunity and a plausible explanation for how the young man might have learned something dangerous. Miss Marple continued her knitting, but every nerve was alert as she observed their visitor's behavior. Mrs. Sinclair's eyes moved constantly around the room, cataloging family photographs, personal correspondence, and the small details that revealed so much about people's lives. This was not casual social observation, but systematic intelligence gathering by someone with professional training. I do hope the investigation won't disrupt village life too severely, Mrs. Sinclair continued. Though I understand the police have made an arrest. Such efficiency speaks well of local law enforcement. The comment seemed designed to gauge their reaction to Silas Crofton's arrest, and Miss Marple detected something almost eager in the woman's expression, as if she were particularly interested in ensuring the official investigation proceeded without deviation. When Mrs. Sinclair finally departed, she left behind more than expensive perfume and subtle menace. As she gathered her coat from the hall stand, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a detail that confirmed her worst suspicions: a small, carefully mended tear in the fabric where a button had been torn away, positioned exactly where someone might lose such an ornament during a violent struggle. But what government secrets had Miss Marple uncovered in her quiet village investigations that now threatened to destroy not only her own peaceful existence, but the lives of anyone unfortunate enough to stand in the way of Mrs. Sinclair's deadly mission? The moment Mrs. Sinclair's elegant figure disappeared beyond the vicarage gate, Miss Marple rose from her chair with uncharacteristic urgency. The mended tear in that expensive coat had revealed more than its owner realized. It was physical evidence of a violent struggle, proof that the woman's carefully constructed alibi was built upon lies and murder. Mrs. Torrington, observing her friend's sudden animation, followed with obvious concern. "Jane, you look as though you've seen something deeply troubling. That woman's visit has unsettled you considerably." Miss Marple moved to the window, her sharp eyes tracking Mrs. Sinclair's retreating form until it vanished into the gathering dusk. The tear in her coat, Hester, it was mended from the inside with considerable skill, but hastily. Someone cared greatly about maintaining appearances, but had no time for proper repairs. That suggests the damage occurred unexpectedly, inconveniently, perhaps during a struggle with poor Timothy. Before Mrs. Torrington could respond, Colonel Weatherby appeared at the front door, his usually robust demeanor subdued by obvious urgency. He waited until they were seated in the drawing room before leaning forward conspiratorially. "Miss Marple, I've been conducting some reconnaissance of my own regarding our mysterious Mrs. Sinclair. Those motor cars visiting the mill house, I've noted their registration numbers, and more importantly, I've observed their occupants." His military bearing became more pronounced as he continued. One fellow had the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to following orders without question. Intelligence services, I'd wager, or something similar. The whole operation has the hallmarks of official surveillance. This confirmation of Miss Marple's suspicions sent a chill through her thoughts. If Mrs. Sinclair was indeed connected to government intelligence services, it explained her access to classified information about past cases and her professional approach to eliminating complications. The telephone's sharp ring interrupted their conference. Mr. Torrington answered with his customary courtesy, but his expression grew increasingly grave as he listened. "Inspector Craddock for you, Miss Marple. He says it's most urgent." The inspector's voice carried through the receiver with barely controlled tension. "Miss Marple, there's been a development that changes everything. Silas Crofton was found dead in his cell this morning, apparent heart attack, according to the police surgeon, but there are circumstances that trouble me greatly." Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. The convenient death of the primary suspect eliminated the most obvious alternative to Mrs. Sinclair's guilt, while providing a tidy conclusion to the official investigation. "What sort of circumstances, Inspector? What sort of circumstances?" He'd written what appears to be a confession before he died, claiming responsibility for Timothy's murder, but the details don't match our evidence. And we've found traces of an unusual substance on his dinner tray. The police surgeon is conducting additional tests, but I suspect we're dealing with something far more serious than a village quarrel. After the call ended, Miss Marple sat in contemplative silence while the implications crystallized. Crofton's death removed. Convenient scapegoat, while providing false closure to the investigation. The forced confession would satisfy bureaucratic requirements without encouraging deeper inquiry into the true circumstances. Colonel Weatherby's subsequent intelligence confirmed her worst fears. "The mill house has been abandoned, Miss Marple," I observed Mrs. Sinclair's departure during the night. Professional efficiency. No wasted motion. This morning I investigated the cottage myself. It's been cleaned with military thoroughness, not a fingerprint, not a scrap of evidence remaining. Even the garden paths have been raked smooth. This systematic elimination of evidence spoke of resources and training far beyond what any individual could command. Mrs. Sinclair was clearly part of a larger organization, one capable of mounting elaborate surveillance operations and eliminating inconvenient witnesses with ruthless efficiency. Most disturbing was the realization that Mrs. Sinclair's departure marked not the end of the threat but its transition to the next phase. The woman possessed the raffle ticket that would take her to Street Mary Mead, providing perfect cover for whatever operation she intended to conduct there. That evening, Miss Marple composed 2 letters with careful deliberation. The first, ostensibly to her nephew Raymond, contained innocent observations about country life. The second, much shorter note, employed the sort of careful language that would be perfectly clear to certain government officials who owed their current positions partly to a quiet spinster's previous discretion in matters of national security. As she prepared for her own return journey the following morning, Miss Marple studied the mysterious telegram once more. "I know what you did." The phrase now carried the weight of genuine threat, not personal revenge, but professional retribution for past interference in carefully controlled situations. Whatever secret from her past had attracted such dangerous attention, Mrs. Sinclair intended to exploit it in Street Mary Mead, where Miss Marple's friends and neighbors would become unwitting participants in a deadly game whose rules she was only beginning to understand. But what classified operation had Miss Marple unknowingly disrupted during her previous investigations, and how could she protect her beloved village from an enemy who possessed every advantage except one? The fatal underestimation of a seemingly harmless elderly spinster whose gentle exterior concealed a mind as relentless as any. Professional operative? The journey back to Street Mary Mead provided Miss Marple with precious hours to consider her strategy. Though the familiar countryside rolling past the railway carriage windows offered little comfort, she had dispatched her carefully coded letters from Little Wychford Station, trusting that certain government officials would recognize the subtle urgency beneath her seemingly innocent observations about country weather and village life. Now she faced the prospect of returning to her beloved home, knowing that a professional killer would soon follow, armed with detailed intelligence and a mission that centered disturbingly on Miss Marple herself. Dr. Haydock waited at the station with his usual gruff courtesy, though his sharp medical eye immediately detected the tension beneath her composed exterior. During the short drive through familiar lanes, Miss Marple found herself studying her peaceful village with new eyes, seeing potential vulnerabilities where once she had observed only comfortable routine. Her cottage appeared exactly as she had left it, rose garden blooming, windows gleaming in the afternoon light. Everything in perfect domestic order. Yet as Dr. Haydock carried her small case to the door, Miss Marple's experienced gaze caught details that sent warning signals through her mind. The spare key beneath the third flower pot had been replaced at a slightly different angle, and the latch on her garden gate bore tiny scratches that suggested careful manipulation. "Leonard," she said quietly, "I wonder if you might stay for tea. I find myself reluctant to enter alone just now." Their subsequent inspection revealed the work of a professional. Nothing appeared obviously disturbed, yet the subtle signs were unmistakable to someone trained in human observation. Books had been removed and replaced with minute differences in position. Personal correspondence examined and returned to drawers with microscopic variations from their original arrangement. Even her knitting basket showed evidence of systematic searching. "They were mapping your life, Jane," Dr. Haydock observed grimly. "Learning your habits, your relationships, your vulnerabilities." As if summoned by their conversation, Miss Marple's telephone rang with sharp insistence. She answered with unusual caution, and the cultured voice that greeted her was chillingly familiar. "Miss Marple, this is Evelyn Sinclair. I wanted to thank you personally for the lovely raffle prize. I'm already settled into Seaview Cottage and finding Street Mary Mead absolutely charming. The casual mention of her exact location sent ice through Miss Marple's veins. Seaview Cottage was less than half a mile away, providing perfect observation of all village activities. I do hope we'll have opportunities to continue our fascinating conversation. Mrs. Sinclair continued smoothly. Perhaps you could recommend some interesting locations for my morning walks? I find myself particularly interested in local history, the sort of stories that live on in community memory rather than official records. After ending the call, Miss Marple retrieved a telegram that had arrived during her absence. Where the first had contained 5 threatening words, this message was even more precise. Your village is not as innocent as it appears. I wonder what your friends would say if they knew. The implications crystallized with uncomfortable clarity. Mrs. Sinclair was not merely targeting Miss Marple personally, she intended to exploit the village's social fabric, using the interconnected relationships and hidden secrets that existed in any small community as weapons in her deadly game. Over the following days, Miss Marple resumed her familiar routines while conducting her own careful reconnaissance. She made strategic visits to Mrs. Bantry, whose residence offered excellent observation of Seaview Cottage, and engaged in seemingly casual conversations with the postmistress and shopkeeper, gradually building a network of informal intelligence that would serve her well in the confrontation to come. Most significantly, she began to understand the true scope of her enemy's preparation. Mrs. Sinclair had not simply arrived in Street Mary Mead, she had been studying the village for weeks, possibly months, learning its rhythms and relationships with the thoroughness of a military campaign. The elegant woman who now strolled the familiar lanes each morning, charming the locals with her sophisticated manner and carefully placed questions, was systematically gathering ammunition for an assault on everything Miss Marple held dear. The realization that her peaceful sanctuary had become a battlefield filled Miss Marple with a cold determination that would have surprised those who knew her only as a gentle spinster with a talent for knitting and an unfortunate tendency to stumble upon unpleasantness. But what devastating secret from her past investigations had finally attracted such lethal professional attention, and how could Miss Marple turn her intimate knowledge of village life into a weapon against an enemy who possessed every advantage except one? The fatal underestimation of a woman whose gentle exterior concealed a mind as relentless and calculating as any intelligence operative. The 4th morning of Mrs. Sinclair's residence in Street Mary Mead brought Miss Marple the confirmation she had been dreading. Her strategic conversations with village residents over the past few days had revealed a pattern of inquiries that chilled her to the bone. Mrs. Sinclair was not simply gathering general gossip, she was conducting a systematic archaeological dig through the buried secrets of Street Mary Mead, targeting specific incidents that Miss Marple had quietly helped resolve over the years. Mrs. Bantry's troubled report over morning tea provided the most disturbing evidence. She knew about Arthur's difficulties in India, Jane details that were never made public, the business with the missing regimental funds that you helped us sort out so discreetly. She spoke as if she'd read the confidential reports, knew exactly which officers were involved and how the matter was resolved without scandal. This revelation sent ice through Miss Marple's veins. That particular affair had involved delicate matters of military honor and colonial administration, resolved through careful negotiation and the quiet return of misappropriated funds. The details were known only to a handful of people, certainly not to any casual newcomer researching family history. Dr. Haydock's subsequent visit brought equally troubling intelligence. She's been asking about medical records, Jane specifically about that business with Professor Pemberton 3 years ago. Wanted to know about the circumstances of his death. Who was present? What observations led to the investigation? She knew far more about the case than any outsider should. The memory of Professor Pemberton crystallized with uncomfortable clarity. The charming foreign academic who had visited Street Mary Mead under such unfortunate circumstances, whose cultured manner had fooled everyone except Miss Marple's instinctive understanding of human nature. Her quiet observations had led to the exposure of a sophisticated espionage operation, preventing the theft of classified documents that could have compromised British operations across Eastern Europe. That afternoon, as if summoned by Miss Marple's growing unease, Mrs. Sinclair appeared at the garden gate. Gone was any pretense of social pleasantry. Her elegant features held the cold calculation of a professional preparing to close a long-pursued case. "Miss Marple," she said without preamble, settling uninvited in the garden chair. "I think it's time we dispensed with the charming village theatrics, don't you? We both know why I'm here." Miss Marple continued her knitting, though her needles moved with mechanical precision rather than their usual comfortable rhythm. "I'm afraid I don't follow your meaning, Mrs. Sinclair, though I suspect that may not be your real name." The woman's smile was sharp as winter frost. "Elena Volkov, if you prefer accuracy, and you're quite right to be suspicious, Miss Marple. I've come a very long way to make your acquaintance, farther than Little Wychford, I assure you." The name meant nothing to Miss Marple, but the woman's transformation from elegant newcomer to cold professional was complete. This was someone who viewed human life as a series of problems to be solved through elimination. Professor Pemberton was more than a charming academic. Mrs. Volkov continued, her voice carrying the controlled menace of someone accustomed to being feared. "He was my most valuable asset, the centerpiece of an operation that had taken years to establish. Your interference cost my organization millions in lost opportunities and several irreplaceable contacts. You destroyed something that could never be rebuilt." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the calm of someone who had suspected the truth for days. "I merely observed that the professor's interest in local history seemed remarkably focused on matters of current strategic importance. Human nature, Mrs. Volkov, has patterns that become quite obvious once you know what to look for." "Indeed it does," Mrs. Volkov agreed, "which is why I've spent considerable time studying your not-or-stake patterns, Miss Marple. Your methods, your relationships, your unfortunate tendency to involve yourself in matters beyond your understanding. Did you really think there would be no consequences for your meddling?" The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the sort of professional detachment that made it more chilling than any emotional outburst. Mrs. Volkov was announcing not personal revenge, but the execution of a carefully planned operation. "I've mapped your entire social network," she continued conversationally. Mrs. Bantry with her husband's colonial secrets, Dr. Haydock with his convenient access to medical records, young Raymond with his government connections in London. So many pressure points, so many ways to ensure your cooperation, or to demonstrate the consequences of continued interference. As Mrs. Volkov departed with gracious thanks for the enlightening conversation, Miss Marple realized that the deadly game had entered its final phase. This was not a simple matter of personal vengeance, but a professional operation designed to neutralize her permanently while sending a clear message to anyone else who might consider interfering in intelligence matters. The woman's systematic targeting of village secrets revealed the true scope of her preparation. She had not simply arrived to eliminate Miss Marple, she intended to destroy the entire fabric of Street Mary Mead's social structure, using the community's buried secrets as weapons to ensure compliance or create chaos. But what Mrs. Volkov had failed to understand was that Miss Marple's greatest strength lay not in her reputation for solving mysteries, but in her intimate knowledge of human nature, including the fatal flaw that would ultimately destroy even the most professional killer: the arrogance that comes from believing that elderly spinsters are helpless victims rather than formidable opponents who have spent a lifetime observing the darkest corners of the human heart. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her familiar chair by the window, her knitting needles moving with deceptive tranquility while her mind worked with the precision of a master strategist. Elena Volkov's revelation had crystallized the danger with uncomfortable clarity, but it had also revealed something equally important: the woman's fatal flaw. Professional operatives, Miss Marple reflected, were trained to exploit human weaknesses, yet they often remained blind to their own. The discreet tap at her back door came precisely at 10:30. Miss Marple admitted two men who entered with the careful movements of those unaccustomed to clandestine village visits. Inspector Craddock removed his hat with obvious discomfort at the unusual circumstances, while his companion, a spare, distinguished gentleman in late middle age, carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to handling delicate matters far from public scrutiny. "Good evening, Miss Marple," said Sir Henry Calthorpe, formerly of the Foreign Office, and now something rather more discreet. "I received your coded correspondence. Our investigation confirms that the woman calling herself Evelyn Sinclair is indeed Elena Volkov. formerly attached to an organization with interests frequently opposed to our own. Miss Marple poured tea as though discussing parish flowers rather than international espionage. She spoke of Professor Pemberton as if he were her life's work, Sir Henry. I suspect her mission here serves a dual purpose, personal revenge and professional demonstration. Inspector Craddock leaned forward with obvious concern. The reports from Little Wychford confirm your suspicions about the murders. Digitalis in Crofton's system, carefully administered to mimic heart failure. This woman eliminates complications with ruthless efficiency. Sir Henry set down his cup with deliberate care. We cannot move openly without risking exposure of operations better left buried. However, if Mrs. Volkov were to commit a crime on British soil, in full view of reliable witnesses, Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. I believe she can be encouraged to do precisely that. She cannot resist demonstrating her superiority, and people who must prove their cleverness can be led into traps built from their own conceit. The following afternoon, Miss Marple extended an invitation that would have seemed perfectly innocent to any casual observer. Mrs. Bantry and Mrs. Dolly Weatherford were invited for tea, along with their mysterious new neighbor. The conversation that ensued would later be remembered as one of the most extraordinary social gatherings in Street Mary Mead's history. Mrs. Volkov arrived precisely on time, her elegant appearance masking the predatory calculation that Miss Marple now recognized as her true nature. The drawing room, with its familiar scents of lavender and beeswax, provided the perfect stage for what was to come. I've been thinking about village secrets, Miss Marple began conversationally, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. How fascinating it is that the most carefully hidden truths have a way of revealing themselves through the smallest details. A mended tear in expensive fabric, for instance, or the particular way someone reacts when their past is mentioned. Mrs. Volkov's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer, a reaction so subtle that only someone trained in human observation would notice. Take Professor Pemberton, Miss Marple continued with apparent innocence. Such a charming man, so interested in local history, though I did wonder about his questions regarding the old church records, not quite the sort of inquiries one would expect from someone researching medieval architecture. More the kind of thing someone might ask if they were seeking information about current strategic importance. The effect was immediate and profound. Mrs. Volkov's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, her professional mask slipping to reveal something raw and personal beneath. The professor was a valuable asset, she said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. His elimination cost my organization years of careful preparation. Mrs. Bantry gasped audibly, finally understanding the true nature of their elegant visitor. But Miss Marple continued as if discussing the weather. Yes, I imagine it did, though I suspect the real loss was not his death but the exposure of your entire network. Once we understood what he was really seeking, it became quite obvious that he was not working alone. The subsequent investigation must have been quite thorough. For the first time since her arrival in Street Mary Mead, Elena Volkov's professional composure showed genuine strain. You know nothing of the forces at play here, old woman. You dabble in village gossip while remaining ignorant of what it costs to survive in a world far removed from your quaint little gardens. Miss Marple smiled with gentle understanding. Perhaps, but I do know human nature, Mrs. Volkov, and I know that even the most professional operative can be undone by personal investment, by the need to prove superiority over those they consider inferior. As Mrs. Volkov departed with barely concealed fury, Miss Marple reflected that the trap was now perfectly set. The woman's pride had been provoked, her professional competence questioned before witnesses. She would not be able to resist the temptation to demonstrate her superiority one final time. But as night fell over Street Mary Mead, Miss Marple prepared for the most dangerous gamble of her long career, knowing that Elena Volkov's wounded pride and professional arrogance would drive her to make the one mistake that would finally expose her deadly game to the watching eyes of those who had waited so patiently in the shadows. The clock in Miss Marple's sitting room had just chimed 11:30 when she heard the faint sound she had been expecting, the almost inaudible scratch of professional lockpicks against her kitchen door latch. She remained perfectly still in her chair, her knitting resting in her lap, though every nerve in her body was alert to the danger approaching through her peaceful cottage. Elena Volkov entered with the fluid silence of someone trained in covert operations, her elegant daytime persona completely transformed. Gone were the fashionable clothes and carefully arranged hair. Instead, she wore dark, practical clothing that allowed her to move like a shadow through Miss Marple's familiar rooms. In her gloved hand, she carried a small leather case that spoke of professional preparation. "Miss Marple," she said softly, her cultured voice carrying the controlled menace of someone accustomed to being feared. "I trust you're not asleep. We have unfinished business to discuss." Miss Marple rose from her chair with deliberate care, her pale blue eyes studying her uninvited guest with the same careful attention she had, once devoted to unraveling village mysteries. "I've been expecting you, Mrs. Volkoff, though I confess I'm curious about your methods. Will it be digitalis again, as with poor Silas Crofton, or something more personal, designed to send a message to others who might consider interfering in your affairs?" Elena's smile was brilliant and utterly without warmth as she opened her leather case to reveal a small syringe filled with clear liquid. "You continue to surprise me with your perception. Yes, Crofton's death was necessary to maintain the fiction of village justice, but your elimination requires more personal attention. You destroyed something irreplaceable when you exposed Pemberton's operation." As she spoke, Elena moved closer with predatory grace, her professional confidence radiating from every controlled gesture. The beauty of this particular compound is that it mimics natural heart failure in elderly subjects. Dr. Haydock will find nothing suspicious, merely the unfortunate but predictable end of a village spinster who involved herself in matters beyond her understanding. Miss Marple maintained her composure despite the proximity of death, though her mind was working with crystalline clarity. "I'm curious about one detail, Mrs. Volkoff. How did you discover my role in exposing Professor Pemberton?" That matter was resolved very quietly, with minimal official documentation. The question struck something raw in Elena's professional facade, and Miss Marple noted with satisfaction how the woman's need to demonstrate superiority overcame her operational discipline. "You think your little village investigations go unnoticed? We maintain detailed files on anyone who interferes with our operations. Your pattern of involvement, your methods, your unfortunate talent for seeing through carefully constructed deceptions, all of it has been studied and catalogued for years." She raised the syringe with practiced efficiency, but her compulsion to justify her actions proved her undoing. "Did you really believe there would be no consequences for destroying years of work? That you could return to your peaceful gardens and knitting while professionals dealt with the wreckage you created?" "Actually," Miss Marple said with gentle firmness, "I rather hoped you would feel compelled to explain yourself so thoroughly. You see, my dear, your greatest weakness has always been your need to prove your superiority over those you consider inferior. It makes you quite predictable." Elena's eyes narrowed dangerously, but before she could respond, Miss Marple continued with the same conversational tone she might use to discuss the weather. "For instance, I knew you would choose tonight for this visit. Professional operatives dislike leaving loose ends, and my little performance yesterday afternoon wounded your pride sufficiently to overcome your usual caution. I also knew you would enter through the kitchen rather than risk the creaking front door, and that you would bring your preferred method of elimination rather than rely on improvisation." The syringe trembled slightly in Elena's grip as the implications of Miss Marple's words began to penetrate her professional confidence. "You're stalling," she said, though her voice carried less certainty than before. "For what? Your village friends? They cannot help you now." "Oh, I'm not stalling, my dear," Miss Marple replied with genuine warmth. "I'm simply observing human nature in action. You see, the moment you entered my cottage tonight, you confirmed everything that Sir Henry's people needed to know about your activities. The listening devices installed during your absence have recorded your confession to multiple murders, your threats against a British citizen, and your admission of conducting unauthorized intelligence operations on British soil." Elena's face went ashen as she realized the trap that had been so carefully constructed around her professional arrogance. "You're lying," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "I'm afraid not," Miss Marple said sadly. "Your organization has already disavowed your activities here. Sir Henry received confirmation this afternoon. You are, as they say in your profession, a burned asset. Your superiors have decided that Elena Volkov is more valuable as a cautionary tale than as an active operative. The syringe clattered to the floor as Elena's professional composure finally cracked entirely. The elegant woman who had terrorized little Whiteford and murdered 2 innocent people now stood revealed as someone whose careful plans had been anticipated and countered by a seemingly harmless village spinster. "This changes nothing," Elena said desperately, though her voice carried the hollow ring of someone whose world had just collapsed. "There are others, operations you cannot imagine, consequences that will follow you to your grave." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed with characteristic gentleness, "but I've found that evil, however sophisticated its methods, ultimately defeats itself through the same human weaknesses that drive ordinary crime: pride, arrogance, and the fatal need to prove superiority over those deemed inferior." As Elena Volkov departed through the same kitchen door she had entered, her threats echoing hollowly in the peaceful cottage, Miss Marple reflected that even the most professional killers remained fundamentally human, subject to the same passions and weaknesses that had been destroying carefully laid plans since the beginning of time. The following morning brought a brief telegram from Sir Henry. Package returned to sender. No forwarding address required. Miss Marple understood perfectly Elena Volkov had been recalled by her organization, her career in ruins, her mission a complete failure. Life in street, Mary Mead resumed its familiar rhythms with remarkable swiftness. Though Miss Marple noticed that her neighbors seemed to appreciate their peaceful village with renewed gratitude. The threat had passed, but the lesson remained. Even in the quietest corners of England, vigilance was the price of safety, and sometimes the most effective guardians were those who appeared least capable of defending anything at all. As Miss Marple settled back into her comfortable routine of knitting and observation, she reflected that while Elena Volkov's immediate threat had been neutralized, the shadows cast by international intrigue would always linger at the edges of even the most peaceful villages, waiting for the next unwary soul to stumble into their web of deception and death. The morning after Elena Volkov's desperate departure brought an unusual quiet to street Mary Mead, as if the village itself was holding its breath while the last threads of international intrigue were carefully severed. Sir Henry Calthorpe arrived before breakfast, accompanied by 2 efficient gentlemen who moved through Miss Marple's cottage with practiced discretion, removing the sophisticated listening devices that had transformed her peaceful sitting room into a theater of espionage. The official record will show that Mrs. Sinclair received urgent word of a family crisis abroad, Sir Henry explained as they watched the technical specialists complete their work. Her hasty departure will be attributed to personal matters rather than professional failure. Elena Volkov, as an identity, has been permanently retired. Inspector Craddock's subsequent visit brought news that provided the final pieces of resolution. The Little Whiteford investigation has been quietly reopened, Miss Marple. New evidence has emerged suggesting that Silas Crofton's confession was obtained under duress, a technicality that allows us to release him without admitting official error. Timothy Green's death will be attributed to an unknown assailant. Case unsolved, but no longer actively investigated. Miss Marple nodded with understanding. Justice, in this instance, would wear the mask of bureaucratic efficiency rather than dramatic revelation. But the essential truth would be preserved where it mattered most, in the safety of innocent people and the neutralization of genuine threat. The village's reaction to Mrs. Sinclair's sudden disappearance followed the predictable patterns that Miss Marple had observed countless times before. Mrs. Bantry expressed relief mixed with lingering unease, while Mrs. Dolly Weatherford proclaimed that she had never quite trusted that woman's smile. The postmistress mentioned unpaid bills with the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been vindicated, and Colonel Weatherby grumbled about foreign elements, while secretly pleased that his military instincts had proven sound. Dr. Haydock, making his rounds with characteristic gruffness, paused longer than usual at Miss Marple's cottage. "You've been through rather more excitement than I'd recommend for someone of your years, Jane, though I suspect you handled it better than most people half your age would have managed." "Experience, Leonard," Miss Marple replied gently, "teaches one that most dramatic situations resolve themselves through quite ordinary human failings. Elena Volkov was undoubtedly a professional, but she was also proud, impatient, and convinced of her own superiority. Those qualities made her predictable, and predictable people can be managed." Young Geoffrey Torrington, visiting from London with obvious relief at his escape from danger, brought news that completed Miss Marple's understanding of recent events. The Foreign Office gentleman who questioned me was quite thorough. Aunt Jane. He seemed particularly interested in whether you had any ongoing connections to sensitive matters. I assured him that your involvement in such things was entirely accidental and unwelcome. Miss Marple smiled at this diplomatic fiction. Quite right, Geoffrey. Though I suspect they understand perfectly well that some accidents have a way of recurring when circumstances warrant. As the weeks passed, Mary Mead settled back into its familiar rhythms with the resilience that had carried English villages through wars, plagues, and countless smaller disruptions. The Women's Institute resumed its gentle feuds over flower arrangements. The vicar preached sermons about forgiveness that carefully avoided any reference to international espionage, and the daily routine of post office gossip and garden gate conversations continued as if sophisticated surveillance operations had never intruded upon their peaceful existence. Yet subtle changes remained, visible only to those trained in human observation. Strangers received slightly more scrutiny before being welcomed into village life. Doors were checked more carefully at night, and Miss Marple herself became, if possible, even more firmly established in the collective consciousness as someone whose gentle exterior concealed capabilities that extended far beyond ordinary village life. One autumn evening, as golden light faded over the church spire and the familiar sounds of rural tranquility settled over street, Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in her accustomed chair by the window, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. The mysterious telegram that had started her recent ordeal lay in her writing desk, filed away with other reminders of humanity's capacity for both extraordinary evil and unexpected redemption. She reflected on Elena Volkov's fundamental mistake, the assumption that knowledge of names, addresses, and past cases constituted real understanding of one's opponent. True knowledge, Miss Marple had learned through decades of quiet observation, came not from files and surveillance reports but from recognizing the eternal patterns of human behavior that repeated themselves regardless of setting or sophistication. Professional operatives studied tactics and technology, but they often remained blind to the simple truth that pride, vanity, and the need to prove superiority had been destroying carefully laid plans since the beginning of recorded history. Elena Volkov, for all her training and resources, had been undone by the same character flaws that had destroyed countless murderers in countless English villages. The fatal inability to recognize that underestimating one's opponent was the surest path to defeat. As the village settled into peaceful slumber around her, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The shadows cast by international intrigue had touched Mary Mead, and been dispersed by the steady light of human decency and community vigilance. New threats might emerge from those same shadows, but they would find in her beloved village not a collection of easy targets, but a community protected by the most formidable guardian of all, an elderly spinster whose gentle exterior concealed a mind as relentless and uncompromising as justice itself. The click of her knitting needles resumed its familiar rhythm, a sound of domestic tranquility that had outlasted empires and would, Miss Marple reflected with quiet confidence, outlast whatever new challenges the future might bring to her peaceful corner of England. And so the woman who had known Miss Marple's name before they met became merely another cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating the power of careful observation, community loyalty, and the sort of quiet determination that had been protecting English villages from all manner of threats for countless generations.